8 mice were placed inside a perfect world. 4 males, 4 females. They would never have to search for food. They would never have to search for water. There were no predators, no disease, no harsh winters, no competition for survival. Everything a mouse could possibly need already existed. Nothing had to be earned. Nothing had to be found. If you looked inside that enclosure, you would probably call it paradise. And that is exactly what its creator intended. Because this experiment was built around a simple belief that almost everyone shares. If suffering disappears, life should become better. It feels obvious. Remove hunger and life improves. Remove danger and life improves. Remove struggle and life improves. So what happens when you remove all of them? 5 years later, every single mouse was dead. Not one was killed by disease. Not one starved. Not one was hunted. The food never ran out. The water never ran out. The paradise never disappeared. And yet the colony quietly disappeared inside it. This was not an accident. It was the 25th attempt, the final version of one of the most disturbing social experiments ever performed. Its name was Universe 25. And before the first mouse ever stepped inside, one man had already spent almost 20 years trying to answer a question that still feels uncomfortable today. What happens to a society when nothing is hard anymore? One man refused to accept the obvious answer. His name was John Calhoun. He was not trying to build a better home for mice. He was trying to answer a question that became an obsession. What happens to a society when survival is no longer the problem? Most people thought they already knew the answer. Remove danger and life improves. Remove hunger and life improves. Remove struggle and life improves. It sounded too obvious to question. Calhoun questioned it anyway. Not once, not twice. For nearly 20 years, he kept building new worlds, different layouts, different enclosures, different conditions. Every experiment changed something. Every experiment asked the same question again and again. He watched, he recorded, he started over 24 times. Most researchers would have stopped. 24 failures usually mean the idea was wrong. Calhoun reached the opposite conclusion. If the same pattern kept appearing, then perhaps he wasn't failing to find the answer. Perhaps he was getting closer to it, because something kept happening. No matter how carefully he redesigned the paradise, no matter how much food he provided, no matter how safe he made the world, something always began to break. Not immediately, not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly. The population grew. Life looked successful. Everything appeared to be working, until it wasn't. The same pattern returned again and again. After 24 experiments, Calhoun no longer believed the pattern was an accident. He believed it was trying to tell him something. Universe 25 was not the beginning. It was designed to become the final answer. The experiment no one could dismiss. The paradise that would finally reveal what kept going wrong, even when everything looked right. The paradise was finally ready. Not because it was larger, because it was more carefully designed than anything Calhoun had built before. Every wall had a purpose. Every tunnel led somewhere. Every nesting place had been planned. Food would never run out. Water would never run dry. The temperature barely changed. The cages were cleaned on schedule. Nothing was left to chance. Calhoun believed this world could comfortably support nearly 4,000 mice. He wasn't trying to create a prison. He was trying to remove every excuse. If the colony ever failed, it would not be because the environment had failed it. On the first day, he placed 8 mice inside, 4 males, 4 females. Then he closed the enclosure. At first, almost nothing happened. The mice explored. They learned the tunnels. They discovered where to sleep, where to eat, where to drink. The world was still new. Then the first litters were born. The population began to grow, slowly at first, then faster. Every new generation made the colony feel more alive. Every number pointed in the same direction. Success, the paradise, appeared to be working exactly as intended. If you had visited Universe 25 during those months, you probably would have believed the experiment was proving exactly what everyone expected. Give life everything it needs, and life will flourish. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing hinted at what was coming. And that was precisely what made the next change so difficult to see. The colony kept growing exactly as it was supposed to. More nests, more families, more life. Every number suggested success. Nothing outside the colony had changed. The food was still there. The water was still there. The shelter was still there. The paradise was still keeping every promise it had made. And yet, something inside the colony was beginning to look different. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. The mice were still eating, still sleeping, still raising new litters. Life appeared completely ordinary until you stayed long enough to watch. Some of the younger males stopped searching for territory. They wandered without direction, not because there was nowhere to go, because they no longer seemed to know where they belonged. Others passed them without challenge, without warning, without interest. The behaviors that once gave structure to the colony began to fade. Quietly, nothing announced the change. No single day looked different from the one before it. That was what made it so dangerous. Collapse did not arrive like a disaster. It arrived like a habit, so gradual that almost no one noticed it beginning. If you had walked through Universe 25 that week, you probably would have seen healthy mice, clean nests, full food hoppers. Everything still looked exactly the way success was supposed to look. And yet, something essential had already begun to disappear. Not food, not water, not safety. Something you could not measure by looking at the walls, or the feeders, or the nests. The world outside the mice had remained the same. So why were the mice beginning to change? The colony kept expanding. More mice arrived with every generation. The paradise still worked exactly as designed. No food had disappeared. No water had run dry. No shelter had been lost, and yet something that every healthy society quietly depends on was becoming harder to find. A place, not a place to sleep, a place to belong. In the wild, young males do not remain where they were born. When the colony grows larger, they leave. They find new territory, new space, new purpose. That is how the structure keeps renewing itself. Universe 25 offered no new territory, no unexplored ground, no frontier waiting beyond the walls. Every corner already belonged to someone. Every position had already been filled. For the first time, a generation reached adulthood with nowhere to step forward. The younger males did not fail because they were weak. They failed because the future had nowhere to place them. Some stopped competing. Others stopped trying. They drifted toward the center of the enclosure, not searching, not defending, not building, simply waiting. Day after day, more of them joined. Healthy bodies without healthy roles. If you looked only at the colony, you would have seen more life than ever before. If you looked at the behavior, you would have seen something else. A society quietly producing individuals with no clear place inside it. Nothing outside the colony had changed. The walls had not moved. The food had not disappeared. The paradise had not broken. But one invisible structure already had. And once a society can no longer offer its members a meaningful place, what begins to replace it? The younger males were not the only ones changing. As the colony continued to grow, another pattern began to appear. Not opposite, different. Some mice stopped withdrawing. They moved more often, more quickly, more aggressively, not because they needed more food, not because they needed more space, because something inside the colony was no longer settling. The same paths became crowded. The same shelters became contested. The same encounters began ending differently. Some males forced themselves into places that once had clear boundaries. Others stopped responding altogether. The colony was no longer moving with one rhythm. One group drifted without purpose. Another pushed forward without restraint. The behaviors did not balance each other. They pulled the colony further apart. Calhoun watched the same environment produce completely different responses, not because the paradise had changed, because the structure inside it had. For the first time, it became clear that the colony was no longer sharing the same social world. They still lived inside the same walls. They still ate the same food. They still drank the same water. But behavior was beginning to split. Quietly, gradually, almost one interaction at a time. The collapse had still not arrived, but the society that once held the colony together was beginning to fracture. And if the adults could no longer share the same social structure, what kind of world would the next generation be born into? The adults were no longer the only ones paying the price. As the colony continued to lose its shared structure, another change quietly began. The mothers were still trying to raise their young, but the world they were raising them in was no longer the same. The nests were no longer places of certainty. They became places that demanded constant defense. Again and again, the pressure never seemed to end. Some mothers stopped leaving their nests. Others left them too often. Some could no longer protect every pup. Others seemed to forget how. Not because they lacked food, not because they lacked strength, because the social world that once supported ordinary parenting was quietly disappearing. The colony was still alive. The bodies were still alive. But the invisible structure that had once made raising the next generation possible had begun to break. Some young were abandoned. Others grew up without the ordinary patterns every generation had inherited before them. Something far more important than survival had begun to disappear. Inheritance not inherited through genes, inherited through ordinary life. The future was no longer receiving the same society that had created the past. The adults were still there. The colony was still there. But the bridge between one generation and the next was quietly breaking. And when a generation can no longer inherit a functioning social world, what kind of adults will they become? Some of the young grew up very differently. If you watched the colony from above, they would have been the easiest to admire. Their fur remained perfectly clean. Their bodies carried almost no scars. They rarely joined the fighting. They rarely challenged another mouse. They rarely seemed to struggle at all. At first they looked like the success the experiment had been promising from the beginning. If you had walked into Universe 25 that day, you might have believed these were the healthiest mice in the entire colony. Nothing about them suggested collapse. Nothing about them looked desperate. Nothing about them looked broken. But appearances can survive long after a society begins to disappear. Something far quieter had already changed. They never fought for territory. They never courted a mate. They never raised young. They stopped participating in the future of the colony. Not because they were weak, not because they were sick, because they no longer had a place inside the social world that had created every generation before them. Only then did Calhoun give them a name, the beautiful ones. Beautiful because their bodies had escaped the conflict. Tragic because their future had not. They looked like the colony's greatest success. They had already withdrawn from everything that allowed the colony to continue. And if the healthiest-looking generation had already stepped away from the future, what future did the colony have left? Time kept moving. Morning still arrived. The lights inside the colony never changed. Food was still there. Water was still there. The older mice were still alive. At first, nothing looked empty. The colony still felt full. Then something almost impossible to notice began to disappear. Not food, not shelter, not life. New life. The seasons kept passing, but fewer young mice appeared. The familiar faces remained. New faces grew, quietly, rare. The colony was not becoming smaller. It was becoming older. The adults continued their routines as though nothing had changed. They ate, they slept, they wandered. The beautiful ones still moved through the colony untouched. From above, everything could still look alive until you stopped counting who was there and started noticing who wasn't. The future had stopped arriving. Not all at once, quietly, one missing generation at a time, one empty nest after another. Time kept moving. The colony did not. For the first time, the experiment was no longer waiting to collapse. It was living without a future. The tragedy was never that the mice were dying. The tragedy was that nothing was replacing them. And once a society can no longer replace itself, has its collapse already begun? Because extinction does not always begin with death. Sometimes it begins the moment the future stops arriving. For years, people believed they already knew what Universe 25 had proven. The story seemed simple. Give a society everything it wants, and eventually it destroys itself. The conclusion spread far beyond the laboratory. Comfort became the accused. Abundance became the warning. The experiment became a symbol. Again and again, people looked at the ending. Almost no one stopped to ask whether they had understood the beginning, because that was never the question John Calhoun had spent 20 years trying to answer. He had watched 25 worlds rise and fall. Not once did food run out. Not once did water disappear. Not once did disease sweep through the colony. The paradise kept every promise it had made. Something else kept breaking. Not comfort. Structure, not abundance. Participation, not survival. Purpose. The mice did not disappear because life had become too easy. They disappeared because fewer and fewer had a meaningful place inside the life they were living. The collapse did not begin when resources became unlimited. It began when meaningful roles became unreachable. The world remembered the comfort. Calhoun kept looking at something else, because if the real problem had never been comfort, then the real question had never been how much the mice had. The real question was never what they had. It was what they could still become. And if the world had misunderstood the experiment for decades, what else had it failed to see? For years, people believed Universe 25 had been a warning about comfort. John Calhoun did not. He had watched the same pattern appear again and again, not because food had disappeared, not because the world had become more dangerous, because something less visible had quietly stopped growing. The colony had run out of meaningful places for its members to belong, not places to sleep, places to matter. That was the pattern Calhoun kept seeing. One world after another. The mice could still eat. They could still drink. They could still survive. But survival was no longer enough. What they could no longer do was become something new. And that changed everything. Because humans are not limited to the same world. When physical space stops expanding, another kind of space can begin. A space made of ideas, new work, new responsibilities, new ways to contribute, new reasons to participate. Calhoun believed that was the difference. Not stronger bodies, not greater intelligence, the ability to create new roles before old ones disappear. Only then did he give that idea a name. Ideational generativity. A complicated phrase for a simple truth. A society survives when it keeps creating new reasons for people to matter. That was the future Universe 25 could no longer create. And perhaps that was the real discovery hidden inside Universe 25. Not that comfort destroys a society, but that no society can survive for long if it stops creating a future that people can still belong to. And if humans can always create new reasons to participate, one final question still remains. The mice never knew they were part of an experiment. They simply lived inside the world they were given. When that world could no longer offer a future, they did not create another one. They couldn't. That was the difference. Humans can. Every generation inherits a world built by the people before it, but every generation also decides what kind of world comes next, not only through technology, not only through wealth, but through the roles it creates, the responsibilities it shares, the reasons it gives people to matter. Universe 25 was never a prediction. It was a question we are still answering. John Calhoun believed the answer was not inevitable, because unlike the mice, we are able to imagine new possibilities before old ones disappear. We can create new ideas, new communities, new responsibilities, new purposes. The experiment is over. The question isn't. Perhaps the future of a society has never depended only on the resources it possesses. Perhaps it depends on whether each generation continues to create new reasons for the next one to participate. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson hidden inside Universe 25. Not that comfort destroys civilization, but that every civilization must keep creating a future worth belonging to, because the mice never had a choice. We still do.